Great. So thank you, everyone. Welcome to our webinar here today. I think we'll get started. I know we're waiting for one more speaker and others will join. But simply, I'm very happy that you've all been able to join this webinar that's taken place in the context of the United Nations Science, Technology and Innovation Forum, which is currently taking place in New York. We're obviously online. It gives us an opportunity to bring together a good range of voices to tackle what is quite a broad question and a question to which we don't really yet have an answer, but to talk about a potential knowledge agenda for development to 2030 and beyond. With this, we're very conscious of the fact that next September there will be an SDG summit that will kickstart the process officially of thinking about what happens in the post-2030 agenda, whether we'll have one, which is not guaranteed yet in any way. But in doing so, it allows us to go back and to pick up on some of those overall themes that they originally were with the 2030 agenda of thinking holistically around what needs to be in place in order to achieve sustainable development, in order to achieve a more sustainable, economically, socially, environmentally, more sustainable world. To think about what are the key underpinning factors, what are the rights that need to be in place, what are the conditionalities, the interlinkages that are there. And in doing that, I think we are in a world today, and we're not yet in 27, we're certainly not in 2030, but looking back to where we were in the run up to 2015, there are a number of reasons to think that questions around knowledge are arguably more significant, are certainly more political, more contentious than they were back then. We're in a world where there's a much stronger awareness of the need for information skills. We've moved beyond a world where we purely think in terms of physical connectivity when we want to look at digital inclusion. We're in a world where there's some very significant questions about how do we maintain the integrity of information? How do we safeguard the models that have tried to make sure that have obviously it's never been fully possible to do it, but made sure that the information that we can receive can be verified, that there is such a thing as at least verifiable information out there. We're in a world where, of course, we've seen the rise of AI that's posing some pretty unprecedented threats to the infrastructure that we rely on for knowledge, in particular open infrastructures, and asking some pretty serious questions there. We've seen the open movement in general evolve, mature, arguably, move into a different place to where it was before. We've seen growing awareness of the importance of media and information literacy skills out there. So there's a huge number of issues that are coming together, often from different perspectives, often from different angles. But we're also seeing some positives. I think certainly questions around the growing awareness of the need to make sure that policy decisions are also based on evidence. That's there. We can see it within the UN in the context of UNT 2.0, with the creation of scientific panels to advise at least the current United Nations Secretary General. So there's also positive things. It's not just sort of fears. It's not just things that are going wrong. I said we are still a year and a half out from the SDG summit. There's a lot to play for, but what we wanted to do with this side event to the SDI forum today was bring together a range of quite eclectic, different approaches to the question of knowledge and what sort of how might knowledge what is the place of knowledge in the post 2030 agenda, what sort of actions, what sort of emphasis on it might we see in there. So to introduce very quickly, so I'm Stephen Weiber. I'm Director for External Affairs at the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. I'm very happy to be joined by colleagues from Elsevier, also STM, talking from the perspective of the publishing industry, and I will introduce each of the speakers one by one. From the International Science Council, that's of course done a huge amount of really valuable work on science policy interfaces and more. From the SDG Academy, from the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, that really takes this quite holistic view of the SDGs and the concept of sustainable development. From Wikimedia, which is, of course, probably the most prominent example of an open infrastructure out there, and has demonstrated some of the original ideals of the internet, and has done such a fantastic job in making information accessible to all. And from Makerere University, and recently of the Media and Information Alliance Global Advisory Council. So we have some quite different ideas. We've been saying to all the speakers, we're not promising a narrative, we're not promising an answer from our discussions today, but hopefully what we will do is bring out sort of the importance of knowledge, the idea that certainly this is not a topic that can be taken for granted as we go forwards. The format that we will use, each of the speakers will talk for 5 to 7 minutes and give their pitch on their issues, and then we'll start having a discussion amongst ourselves. Certainly, we would encourage anyone who has questions, ask them in the Q&A, and we'll look to get to them as well. But so with that, I'm very happy to invite our first speaker to the floor, Rachel Martin. She's the Senior Global Director on Sustainability at Elsevier. She's taken a leading role on underlining, on promoting the idea, the importance of sustainability, not just within the company, but also through roles with the International Association of Scientific, Technological and Medical Publishers, STM, and the International Publishers Association. She's done a lot of work on the climate dimension, but of course, when we're talking about sustainability, it also goes beyond that. And so I'm very happy to invite Rachel to the floor to talk from the perspective of the publishing sector. Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Great to be here. I quite like this topic because I feel like most of you probably in the audience is that I'd love a crystal ball to tell me what the future is going to hold. But the past decade has really shown anything is that that's a pretty difficult task. I think when the Sustainable Development Goals were adopted back in 2015, I don't think we ever anticipated just the level and severity of the disruption that we've seen. We had a global pandemic, financial instability, and as we're speaking today, there's over 130 armed conflicts currently happening. And I think that's double the number that was there 15 years ago. And I think this means for our discussion, and we'll get into the other speakers' perspectives around that, is that the context with which the SDGs were originated from is fundamentally changed. And the systems and the shared values that we rely on are being tested. And one of the most critical things around them is this idea of a healthy information ecosystem. So when I talk about that, what I'm thinking about is how we generate, how we share, and how we apply trusted knowledge. And that's ultimately going to determine whether we can achieve that ambitious vision that was set out in 2015, right? Something that was more sustainable, more equitable, more inclusive. And yet, as we stand today, we see those multilateral foundations, which really underpin the SDGs, under strain. The processes around climate or biodiversity COPs are facing increasingly political tension and declining consensus. So in areas that I'm passionate about, like climate action, we used to have this broad global alignment, and now we're seeing diverging prioritization and approaches. And this makes the trusted evidence-based knowledge ecosystem not only more important, but also more contested. And so that question and what I'm thinking about and reflecting from my perspective is how do we maintain a healthy scholarly knowledge environment? And to do that, so I'm kind of drawing on a couple of different things. I did a really interesting project at the end of last year, and I interviewed the 10-member group that's appointed by the UN Secretary General to advise the UN on science, technology, and innovation. And I asked them pretty much the same question. I wanted to know how effective the SDG framework was and what's their thoughts of what happens beyond 2030. And there's three kind of key insights which I wanted to kind of go through. The first one is I think we should recognize that the SDG framework has been pretty darn successful. Many people are going to talk about maybe a lack of progress or, this target might be off. But as a framework, it's been pretty essential in bringing sustainability and I think indeed planetary boundaries into the mainstream global policy discussion. And it did this because it linked environment with social and with economic development, and it made it part of a broader sustainability agenda. And this meant it didn't matter if you're in a high-income country or a low-income country, these goals like clean water and sanitization were equally as relevant. And I think that has been the awareness that has happened. In higher education, what I'm hearing is that you can't just pull out a lesson plan from 15 years ago. We can't be teaching MBAs without talking about the limits of planetary boundaries. We can't be talking about chemistry without thinking about green chemistry. This has fundamentally moved our idea of what sustainability is. And what I find quite refreshing is that when you go to a conference, say you're in Kenya, a researcher is going to get up and he's going to say, hey, my research relates to SDG number 4. This global multi-sector approach has been incredibly helpful of creating something which just wasn't on our agenda. This isn't the Millennium Goals, which was something about health, something in the global south. This is about a shared agenda. And I think that has been really critical. The second kind of point that I think is interesting is that the the global research landscape is fundamentally changing. So knowledge production is becoming multipolar. And this means that we're seeing significant contributions from lower middle income countries. If you think back to 1970, 94% of the research output came from high income countries. In 2024, 60% of research is coming from lower middle income countries. And I'm including China into that figure. But even if you take China out, you see these elevated levels coming from lower middle income countries. And this holds true for the research related specifically to the SDGs and their underlying targets, where roughly about half the research for SDGs is attributed to authors that are located in lower middle income countries. And that remarkable shift filters, well, needs to be starting to filter into international organizations. If we think about coalitions of the willing, where do they get reflected? Is our international associations reflecting these shifting priorities? And I think it's a really interesting and strong way to be starting to think about what I think is the third point, which is around that more inclusive, trusted, and coordinated knowledge system. And when we start thinking about weakening alignment, progress is going to develop or exceed or accelerate based on stronger collaborations, better science policy connections, and greater trust in how knowledge is produced and used. And that is really, really critical because what we have is rising political interference, financial pressures on higher education, and a growing ideological polarization that is threatening researchers' abilities to explore these topics freely. And we see this come in terms of what type of national collaborations are there? What type of key technologies have to be protected? And what does that mean for those types of collaborations? And the whole rise of a woke agenda where, we suddenly start seeing censorship of topics like, inclusion and diversity, sustainability, many of the things encompassed by those SDGs. And this has a chilling effect. I'm located in Amsterdam, so in the Netherlands, and last year, 2/3 of universities have reported a declining student enrollment in climate and sustainability courses, sharp decreases in this. And so this really sort of points to the ideas of shifting priorities. So what's my sort of concluding, more slightly optimistic approach to this? Well, I think the knowledge ecosystem has to build resilience, right? We have to ensure that knowledge systems and the processes that underline these can operate efficiently despite geopolitical tensions and uncertainty. If you're thinking about SDG number 14, 15, protecting the oceans, oceans don't have country boundaries. We still need to have collaborations which are happening in countries like Russia, which hold vital data around the Arctic shelf. We have to think about enabling inclusion and balance. So supporting a more equitable global research system that reflects this changing geography of knowledge. We have to start thinking about that collaborations. We'll be looking at maybe localized or regional issues. So for example, in clean energy technology, Saudi Arabia is coming up to one of the top 10 knowledge producers in that. And they're doing that by collaborating with countries like Egypt, for example. And that makes complete sense. But that changes how we think about knowledge production. And the third is really around trust and integrity, right? We need academic freedom, we need research integrity, and we need a robust information system that will enable our knowledge to be credible and actionable. And so I think from my perspective and from publishing, it's really looking about creating the foundations to navigate that uncertainty and having collective progress towards 2030 and beyond. And I'll finish there and make sure everybody else can have their perspective.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I think there's that also that parallel that you drew between the value of having that cross-border international agenda in the SDGs and people having seen, well, actually, despite all the detractors, despite all the hand-wringing, that you actually ask people and they say, well, it has helped. It has actually changed mindsets. And maybe that's not something that's easily countable, but it is something that's changed the way that people think about things, which has significant, if tough to measure, downstream impact. and then actually applying that logic to the knowledge space, and also seeing that as also something where having that global approach that goes beyond borders, that also ideally goes beyond regimes, and whatever fad is here from one year to the next is super important. And I can feel a question sort of emerging around public goods and things like that, but maybe we'll get onto that subsequently. Excellent. So now I'm going to hand over therefore to Maria Steli, um, who works at I got this written down, the UK Centre for Ecology and Hydrology. She's also a board member of the International Science Council. Her day job is as an international research manager. She's got a very strong focus on the interface between academia and policy, and actually that making sure that we're making that bridge between that scientific space that you talked about, that scientific research space that you talked about, Rachel, and actually making sure that the decisions happen and decisions are based on that lead us to ideally better outcomes than we have right now. So over to you, Maria.
Thank you so much. Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you for convening this conversation to the International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions, an ISC member. And thank you to my fellow panelists as well. It's a pleasure to join this side event at a moment when questions around knowledge, trust, and international cooperation are becoming central to sustainable development itself. And I would like to begin with a story, one that might be familiar to some of you and new to others. So let's go back to the mid 50s of the 20th century, at the height of the Cold War. Um, Scientists from more than 60 countries came together for what became known as the International Geophysical Year. And I would love to hear from participants if they are familiar with this event that transformed Earth system science. It advanced Antarctic research. Actually, it created the concept of Antarctica as we know it. It laid the foundations for the tectonic plate theory that measures every time there is an earthquake on Earth. It has strengthened the global monitoring systems. It contributed to the foundations of climate science that I work every day, as Stephen was saying, as my day job. And mostly, it demonstrated the extraordinary power of scientific collaboration. Scientists shared data, developed common standards, built research networks, and created infrastructure for what we know today as international scientific cooperation. So basically, scientists coordinated across borders. What did we learn from that event as a humanity? That despite profound geopolitical tensions happening back then in the mid of the 20th century, we recognize something pretty essential. Understanding the Earth could not be done in isolation. No single country can fully understand the atmosphere, the oceans, the poles, the seismic activity. And perhaps the most important lesson is that knowledge itself is a bridge, not simply a collection of information, but a shared global endeavor built on trust, on openness, on institutions, on cooperation. And today, nearly 70 years later, we face a different but equally complex moment. Growing military conflicts around the world. Rachel made a reference to this. Actually, according to the 2025 Global Peace Index, uh, we are in a decline at its lowest level since the end of World War II. This is the world that we live in today. Climate change, biodiversity loss, AI disruption, Stephen mentioned at the introduction. And widening inequalities are challenging not only our ability to generate knowledge itself, but also the ability to trust it, which is the essential part. And as Robert Dickraff, our president-elect of the International Science Council, which is in New York, participating in the SCI forum, he recently wrote in an article this question that for me has been super impactful. The question is whether today's scientific community has the imagination and determination to forge similar partnerships capable of pushing back against divisive political forces as back in the IGY, in the International Geophysical Years. Because in many ways, today's challenges are broader than during that year, um, especially in ensuring societies can access, can trust, can contribute, and can use the knowledge that we're producing at the moment. And I would like to highlight three priorities for a future knowledge agenda. And these are based on my experience working across scientific institutions in both high and low income countries between Europe and Latin America. I have seen both the extraordinary potential of scientific cooperation, but also the persistent inequalities that still shape global knowledge systems. And also, from my perspective at the board of the International Science Council, the future of sustainable development will depend not only on how much we advance science, but also how can we build more inclusive and trusted and globally connected knowledge ecosystems. So, three very simple but difficult to get priorities. Number one, we must move beyond thinking only about knowledge production and knowledge access to knowledge equity. And I would like to go back to what very interesting data that Rachel was sharing about the shift in low and middle income countries. And I wonder how many of those countries are setting the research agenda beyond publications. So access alone is not enough if, for example, countries and communities are not shaping the agendas, are not influencing standards, and not contributing to global decision making in the scientific, but also in the policy world. So, too many inequalities, I feel, persist in scientific infrastructure, in publishing systems, in digital access, in language representation. I am currently speaking in my third language, and believe me, it's not easy to do it when you're not speaking in your native language. You have to work harder, you have to work double. Um, so the challenge is not only closing the digital divide or the publication divide, but also to close the knowledge participation divide. The knowledge participation is central and is central for the work that the ISC is doing, advocating for a more inclusive and globally represented scientific system. Second, and very short message, science policy interface require long-term investment, and that will depend on how much we trust institutions, how much are we maintaining long-term relationships between scientific partners, how much countries have a translation capacity to go from science and evidence to policy impact. And this is essentially important in a moment where we are adapting to climate um, change. We're setting new biodiversity governance. We're learning more about disaster risk reduction and AI governance. So it's critical. And and my final and third key message is um, one that I haven't shared in panels before, but given the organizer, I wanted to bring it. Libraries and knowledge institutions matter more than ever. So in an increasing age shaped by AI and fragmented information ecosystem, trusted institutions become essential for us. Libraries, universities, scientific organizations. They help us curate reliable information, strengthen our literacy, preserve our institutional memory, build civic trust. They are not only guardians of information, but of democratic resilience itself. And I think that's why today's conversation matters so much. It matters to me personally as a young woman from Latin America, as someone who has worked across different scientific and institutional realities, but also as someone who believes deeply on democratic values and that knowledge and democratic values are inseparable. So libraries, scientific institutions are critical for that end. So let me finish with one question. Can we build the equivalent of a new international geophysical year for the knowledge challenges of the 21st century? That's the challenge of our generation. One that is not only about scientific discovery, about producing knowledge, but about equitable participation, about trusting our institutions, and about global cooperation as a public good. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. I sort of feel like if I try to paraphrase what you've said, I will not do it justice. I think, and just immediate reactions coming out of there. I think we already talked a little bit about public goods in response to what Rachel was saying, but that the relevance of again using the the UN as a space where you can step outside of the national, and that you just need full stop in order to take on major issues, and with the case with geophysics back in the day, but there's so much other stuff now. But then again, getting into those questions around governance and the decisions that you make within there in order to ensure equity, because anarchy doesn't necessarily serve anyone. Anarchy tends to serve the strong, and so that need for governance in order to make sure that everyone's there. I think that focus on institutions is really interesting. It's not something that, given the capacities-based approach, which I think is generally a very good thing, and focusing on individual capacities, but actually that value of focusing on the infrastructures that make that possible is a really interesting angle going forward. And obviously, if you say nice things about libraries, of course we like that. So thank you. Excellent. I think there's I think I'm going to be thinking about this way after this way after this webinar ends, but obviously I'll need to try and come up with some conclusion at the end. What I will do then now is hand over to Costanza Struber Caniglia, who is she's a policy expert advising government and international institutions on AI governance, information integrity, global digital regulation. At the moment, she's the policy lead at the Wikimedia Foundation, and is also a member of the World Economic Forum's Global Futures Council on Information Integrity. So it's very much thinking at this macro scale about the impact of broader trends on key open infrastructures like Wikimedia, and is right at the heart of some of those discussions. And I think we've talked about trust a few times, and by talking about information integrity, we also then run right into the heart of that as well. But Costanza, over to you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you for organizing this really, really timely panel. I'm always happy to talk after the other panelists because I already have learned so much. First, I want to echo 1000% what Maria just said. I think institutions, particularly libraries and other knowledge institutions, will be so important in this new phase. And yeah, so I bring a little bit of a different perspective. My day job is working at the Wikimedia Foundation, which is the organization that hosts Wikipedia and other knowledge, open knowledge projects. Like some people might be familiar with Wikidata, Wikicommons, and others. And so our main goal is, the slogan is that everyone everywhere can join in the sum of all knowledge. So it's not necessarily about the encyclopedia per se, right? But we want people to have access to knowledge that is reliable, that is sourced. This is very important. This is something that we are losing in this new phase of the internet, and that is also globally available but locally produced. And what I mean with this is that we have different communities all over the world. Wikipedia has 330 plus languages. Each language is a community, and this community writes their own content, designs their own policies, and develops their own, perspective and sources. Now, why is this important? And I'm going to say a little bit more about how Wikipedia and the other projects work today, and then think about what is happening, because I think the system is breaking down. The open knowledge system, digital public goods system, we're really at a moment of crisis. So we should think how we move forward from here. So the way it works is we, meaning the foundation, host the servers, we have the legal responsibility, etc. But we don't touch the content, because the idea is that really the communities and 200,000, 250,000 volunteers and more that we have all over the world work on the content. And I want to stress again that the content is really localized, right? So it is And what we are hearing from governments, what we're hearing from communities, what we are hearing from just people in the age of AI is that this local knowledge is getting lost when LLMs have kind of a more standardized vision and don't reproduce the perspectives that are local. Now, what is happening right now is we also have a commitment to make this knowledge open and available to all. So it's free and it will forever be free. However, the issue that we're having is that in the past couple of years, we've seen an incredible increase in uptick of like 50% and more of traffic coming from bot traffic. Because Wikipedia is not only one of the 10 most visited websites in the world, which, might not mean anything in a year or so. I don't know that websites as we think about them today, will still be there in that sense. But it's also one of the main data sets of training data for LLMs. And what that means is that we think about information integrity and the knowledge that we share in these two kind of layers, right? Like people address like entering Wikipedia and accessing the content directly, but also people accessing the content through other platforms, which can be an LLM, but in previous years it was search and digital assistants and so on and so forth. But now we have an uptick of 50% of traffic. Of this traffic, 30% or so we are slowing down or blocking. But what has changed from before is that while we always had this traffic and then this, bot artificial traffic, not only the scale, but also the type of traffic, in the sense that there was a standardized way or norms and rules that the open source community used to make sure that the websites they were scraping were protected in a way that is no longer the case. Not only we are having bots that kind of don't declare themselves as such, don't limit themselves, but also they sometimes use shady networks that they're called residential proxies. In other words, using people's laptops or other digital devices that are connected to the internet to fake human traffic, when in reality it's bot traffic. Now, while our content is free, our infrastructure is not free. So this has increased the cost of the infrastructure tenfold. There is also, you might have heard, a scarcity of the physical production, right? So it has increased our cost incredibly. It has made the experience worse for humans because it's slower and it's more difficult. We try to limit this traffic and it's in the billions of access per day. So it's really a huge but and from my point of view, I work in policy, right? So what I've tried to do is talk to others and see like, is this a problem that only we face, or how is it going? And what we learned is that there are so many organizations that face this problem, whether it is open knowledge institutions, whether it is open source institutions, where it is open data sets, whether it is government websites or we call public interest media websites, right? So what happens is this creates more walled gardens, because some organizations respond by closing down and asking for money. It creates organization just to disappear. And so all of that knowledge goes away. Or it creates situations in which only some people will have access to that knowledge because they're part of an institution, for example, or, whatever. We think that this, coupled with also the splinternet phenomenon and like larger geopolitical issues of the open internet, whether we can still have an open internet, these two things coupled together create a situation in which really the amount of trusted information on the internet will dwindle down. And the access, Wikipedia is a digital public good, is recognized as a digital public good. So the way we think about digital public goods will need to change. And we're really facing a risk of having knowledge, open knowledge, and trusted knowledge become like a luxury good, where that only some people have access to. So I think, the old internet's not coming back, and the old internet had its own issues as well. I don't, want to paint this rosy picture. But I think collectively it is urgent and important that we start thinking about how do we make sure that in the public square we still have access to information for people, and not just for LLMs, because otherwise we are kind of subsidizing this AI revolution. But then this means taking away knowledge from people. I'm gonna stop here because I want to hear what others have to say, and then looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much. And I think partly what you're saying, it underlines that point about the importance for some sort of governance within here. The idea that we should have governance of the internet is absolutely not original, because there's this thing called the Internet Governance Forum. So that's been around for some time, but also that increasingly that this risk of facing this tragedy of the commons, not quite. I know we can get into the economics of whether it's a common or a good later. And Paul's good in economics, so he can touch on some of those things potentially. But I think that disruption, and I think highlighting that there is this risk, and there is all this effort that's going into knowledge equity that, of course, Rachel and Marie have talked about, and highlighting the importance of it's about access, but it's also about contribution and building up models that do that, but also that's under threat right now from this invasive species that's turned up and is trying to eat everything. Plus, of course, all the politics of, I don't know, so-called critical infrastructure protection and information sovereignty and security when it's abused to shut down borders and make, I don't know, the digital equivalent of something like the geophysics work in the 50s impossible, because you just can't get information across borders. So that highlights really powerfully the urgency of a response. But before we get into digging into things, and I've not yet had anything back from Sarah, so you may well be our last speaker before we go into the conversation, Paul. But now, Paul, you're obviously a familiar in these spaces. For anyone who doesn't know Paul, he's the Vice President of Education and the Director of the SDG Academy, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network. He's on secondment from University College Dublin, where he's a Professor of Global Affairs and Sustainable Development and Director of the Master in Science in Sustainable Development there. So, Paul, over to you for your take.
Yeah, great interventions. I'm actually in a public hallway and at a meeting, and I'm terrified they're all going to come in for their coffee break soon. So I better get on with this before you think there's suddenly a getaway horses or something after coming to get me. I enjoyed all the interventions. That's excellent. So I don't know where to come at this, because where I want to get to is two things. One is I do want to talk about licensing, infrastructure, and public ownership. And I think that's where the last speaker was going a bit. And the role of libraries to solve a lot of the problems there, particularly because I think they have the best public digital infrastructure that goes right across the world, goes underneath all the platforms and websites, and we just don't use them and we don't fund them. So that's something like DSpace, like how they transfer all the digital objects and how they license and archive and metadata and all the rest. But I think I want to start just in my day job at the moment to see, am I walking the talk a little bit, right? So for example, the SDG Academy creates courses online, like MOOCs on edX and Coursera and other platforms, right? And the faculty put them together and UN staff and others put them together for free, and they're under a Creative Commons license. Now, obviously, to have them up on LMSs and certification and stuff, there can be cost, and we do charge for that. But the actual content is in our library. Let's say the videos, the digital objects can be downloaded for free, and they can be repurposed and used, and much easier now with AI and so on. They can be translated into different languages much easier. So is there a guiding star in terms of open education resources? Well, I think there is. The UNESCO 2019 recommendation, I think, is really strong in all its dimensions, and I won't go into it. And we did actually have we have a joint committee in UNESCO that looks at implementing the OER recommendation, but we had a third World OER Congress in Dubai in 2024, November, and we did an addendum to that called the Dubai Declaration, which actually looks at emerging technologies, including AI, to see whether that can enhance the implementation of the OER recommendation. We also, of course, at SDSN, we do publications and stuff. So we, in Dublin, a few of us got the Dublin University Press. It was a vestigial kind of 18th century printing house that a lot of universities have. And we actually decided to actually produce under Creative Commons license, again, archived in Trinity College Library, metadata appropriately in a SDG taxonomy and so on. We decided to basically create that publication for free and to have it completely open access and discoverable on the internet as well, because it has all the appropriate metadata and so on to pick up citations, and obviously put it on all the various platforms, like indexing, they call it, all the different indexes. So we walked the talk there, and of course we produced the SDG dashboard, which is tracking the performance of all countries by the various SDG indicators. And that data we try to operate under what we call open, kind of fair principles. So the Dublin University Press is the open science recommendation. We try to adhere to that. The SDG Academy and the courses is trying to adhere to the open education resource recommendation, and the open data when we actually release the data again. So I'm not going to go through the different problems, but what I do want to say, though, is the question was about knowledge in the post-2030 agenda, right? So I think it's a bit of a mistake to think about it does knowledge fit into science policy interface? Yes. Does it fit behind the Science Technology Innovation Forum and the Technology Facilitation Mechanism? Yes. Does it fit into all the COP processes? So knowledge is there to be used everywhere, and it's certainly very much centered in the Digital Global Compact discussions. You know what I mean? So knowledge is was myself and Tanis came up with then and Stephen and others when we were in discussions in open science. We came up with this idea of a global knowledge commons. So in economics, you have production possibility frontiers. So I'm going to talk about this kind of knowledge possibility frontiers. And so the big questions are, what knowledge has been created? Right? Because as St. John Henry Newman, the founder of my university, would say, is not all knowledge is virtue. Like, a lot of us are producing knowledge for the weapons industry, or not necessarily producing knowledge for peace or sustainable development. So we already have to have processes. It's not about information integrity. It's also about the orientation of knowledge, and is it for pathways to peace and sustainable development, which a lot of funding and a lot of knowledge isn't. And we have to be honest about that, right? The second one, obviously, Maria, I think was taught, was knowledge equity. So what knowledge is actually out there that you can get? All this indigenous knowledge, all the knowledge from history, how has that been crowdsourced and created and put in the knowledge commons? I could have a cure for cancer in Uganda as a master's student, and I might have to pay $12,000 to get into Nature or something. How do I deposit knowledge into the global knowledge commons? And that's real equity. We need to know knowledge, right? The other thing about knowledge is that, going back to Adam Smith, globalization was probably inevitable, but knowledge had to, the reason why we should have also, globalization should bring equity actually, is that knowledge should be freely transferable and usable. So if somebody has advances in one part of the world, they share it with the other part of the world. Now we saw with the COVID vaccine that didn't happen. But that's true of IP on all knowledge and even scholarly publications and so on. People are not easily transferring knowledge. And that's a crime in a sense, right? So what are knowledge institutions, what are we doing to make sure that knowledge is actually easily transferable and not just co-created by people, but is it transferable? And then finally, where does it go? Like what sort of efforts are we making we say it should be accessible and it should move into policy practice and, into all the stakeholders that are trying to implement the SDGs. But we have to work really hard to get SDG-free information that we have into, let's say, parliamentary settings, legislative settings, into bureaucratic side of governments, into corporate professional development, into sustainability, into NGO communities. Like it's not that straightforward to transfer knowledge. And it also has to be repurposed and to put into local context. And there has to be a capacity to receive it and to put it into those contexts. So I think the Global Knowledge Commons it's a really interesting way of thinking about, as a global public good, how is knowledge created? How is it accessible? How is it transferred? How is it repurposed? And a lot of these discussions are in the open science, open OER, and open data recommendations, right? And of course, the librarians are very clever here. They talk about the ethics of it all and the license. So there's Creative Commons licensing and different types of licensing, different type of ethical frameworks like FAIR and CARE and FOREST. We all know them. So that sort of thing is there, right? But the last point, though, is that with the problem of AI and digital ownership of the digital side. Technology, from my point of view, people talk about AI and they say, you're going to be out of the job. What I think is that if the public sector who's creating this R&D should own AI, and we should own the data centers and the digital infrastructures, and we should fund public libraries to do all of this. And then when my robots and my share in those robots are doing great jobs, I get 4 days a week income. Doing nothing, I'm resting. But my share, like I basically have a share in the factor of production, which is a technology and new technologies. But the idea that the public does the research and the private takes the IP, and then only a few shareholders actually own that, and the rest of us then are completely poor and unemployable, that just goes back to the problem that we're not thinking about knowledge as a public good. We're not thinking about the data centers, the infrastructures, the licensing, and actually funding it through public means, right? And what that would mean for me is that there already is a global infrastructure of a digital infrastructure of digital librarians who know exactly how to archive, preserve metadata, license, transfer, right? And would solve Wikipedia's problems in 2 minutes if they actually learned how to download and work with an international library system. And the problem with being out there is that there isn't processes anymore, the ethical processes, the peer review processes, all the different sort of checks and balances that you really need. If you really want an archive that is properly metadated and preserved and so on and so forth, right? So when I'm looking at the Digital Global Compact, I think they get into those issues quite well. I think that there was a lot of conversations about the role of the public and private in that sense. So part to me thinks that the knowledge argument and how knowledge can be created, accessible, distributed, push a world of a pathway to peace and sustainable development is really coming down to the way we're going to talk about the digital transformation. And this is going to be, we're going to win and lose the day on the role of knowledge to powerhouse sustainable development agenda on the way we do the digital transformation. And my plea is to think about public ownership you know, in terms of the roads and the infrastructure, think about licensing. If you want something to be a global public good, use a Creative Commons license. Like, don't just give away the IP. If you want to crowdsource the best sort of information and stuff, you create the processes that do that in terms of knowledge equity, knowledge access, knowledge transfer and distribution, knowledge integrity, knowledge ethics, knowledge orientation. So I think if I was doing something for the post-2030 agenda, I'd really bring it back to those type of basics about the knowledge commons as I discussed it, and to really say this is the engine of all of the MOIs and all of the goals that survive or that are put into a sustainable development agenda. And we could win and lose everything by not protecting knowledge. So it goes a bit back to Ireland, save civilization, you know, just like people who were careful about books and knowledge and protected them, kept them under public protection. We're kind of in that phase where we really do need to start thinking about what is the knowledge that we're creating, how it can be used, where it can be used under ethical and integrity frameworks and so on. But we don't have to reinvent the wheel, because that's how professional libraries are trained. It's just that we're not listening to them, and we're not applying their best practices.
Thank you. And I promise I've not asked people to be nice to libraries in their interventions. It's obviously really nice when you are, but I think, you know, the points you made, you know, brings up the value of the institutions, and, you know, things where there's not necessarily, you know, it's very difficult to appreciate their value if you're thinking purely in terms of return on investment. It's very difficult to appreciate their value if you're not thinking in terms of a commons or a public good that needs to be there. And I think the education angle is always interesting. You know, I still think that the UNESCO report on futures of education or futures of teaching, I think they've changed the name at some point, which brings that also focuses very strongly on this knowledge commons idea, to which everyone can contribute and everyone can draw, is extremely powerful, and it sets out some of those ideas very well. I think you also alluded to, I don't know, which I think is quite a powerful point, that of course knowledge is being talked about in different areas. And if you look through the SDGs that we have, information knowledge is talked about in 7 or 8 places. It's implicit in quite a lot of others, but that doesn't necessarily make it a consistent. It doesn't necessarily make it a consistent approach. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're really looking at knowledge in the round. And so I think, you know, I will have a question about to what extent that digital transformation angle, does that allow us to look at it in a sufficiently coherent way to make the most of it? And I don't know. I think that's actually going to be that'll be my first question to everyone is I don't know, getting the right angle. I suppose just to give you a moment to think about answers on that. I feel in the discussions that we have, and I follow the European level quite a lot in the research angle, it very much depends what hat someone is wearing or what the theme of today's conference is. And so if it's a conference focused on equity, then of course it is all about making sure that everyone can get involved. The minute it's about security, then everyone shuts up and it's all about preventing things getting loose. If it's something about competitiveness, then the focus wildly changes again. And often it's the same people in the room, but it's a different speech. And so I don't know, I'd be interested to follow up on just actually following up explicitly on what you said, Paul, about is this focus of digital transformation, do you think that gives us the breadth to think holistically about the place of knowledge in the post-2030 agenda, or do we need something else or something broader? I don't know, but Paul, do you want to go first and then give the others a moment to think? So this wasn't one of the prepared questions. So
yeah. No, again, I'm taking advice here from librarians, right? So when we digitalized we had a journal, an 1847 journal called, it's a science policy interface journal from a statistical society. So it was when 7 times a year, the government people and statistical people would meet with academics to talk about 7 issues of public policy. And we recorded those meetings and discussions, and they were printed in a journal. This went back to 1847. And again, we did it with membership fees of government departments and universities. So it was a community journal. So it was a diamond publication before there was ever diamond publications, right? But we did decide to take one of the versions that were in one of the libraries. And at the time we had to guillotine beautiful letter. I think at the moment you don't even prefer digital recognition, but it was a good few years ago. And we scanned it all in and we put it in a DSpace archive, and we did the usual, you know, in terms of metadating and so on. So it became a very nice resource. But the point I'm getting to, though, is that we always, it's good practice to keep a hard copy in the backup. So any good library, anything that's online, as in a kind of a digital sense, and best practice in the digital sense is also best practice in the physical sense, right? And even this idea of searchability, when you walk into a physical library, what's the minimum amount of steps to find the book? What's the same online? What's the minimum amount of steps, you know, the clicks actually to find a particular publication? So I think they're particularly, so when I look at the digital transformation, when we're kind of trying to get nearly a digital twin of the physical, then, and it's governed by a lot of the same principles, I think things of conservation and good practices are kind of mirrored on each other, right? The only thing that's very important, though, is that libraries did what's called interlibrary loans, you know, where they'd literally buy boats, you know, transfer books and stuff. Now with digital, that's easier. Obviously, they can transfer digital objects relatively easy. But again, they do it on DSpace compatible technologies, right? They don't use the internet of the West or China or anywhere else, right? They have their own under the surface kind of movement. And libraries do, not all, but a lot of the libraries are publicly owned and they're publicly financed. What's getting them under pressure, of course, is that they actually have to do these open publishing practices where the academics write the papers, they do all the work of archiving, and it's not really the publishing companies at all. But the problem is the libraries are not funded properly to do that. You know what I mean? So they're like the academics, they're being commercialized, but they're not getting paid for that job. While this other sort of duty, I think it's more in their instinct to make things archived, accessible, findable, discoverable. And to me, I think it's more in their DNA, as in academics, to create knowledge that's much more freely usable and repurposable across the world, right? So again, this is the whole problem with the digital transformation, the fragmentation of the technologies, IP issues, ethical issues. You know, a lot of the information, is it correct information? Is it AI hallucinating? All this sort of stuff. That's all out in this new digital privately run world. But it's not the world of a library system that's actually archiving particular collections and, you know, and working on the particular ethics and so on. So I think, yeah, I think we could win and lose the day on the way we think about the digital transformation and knowledge.
I think no, and that. I think that point about it could be an enabler, and of course, a new tech. It's not new really anymore, but a new way of doing things technologically can be a new way of doing things physically, legally, as well. If you seek the epictic thing at the same time, I'm always conscious that you know we
So
are
when I give you one example, just and then I'll stop talking, right? So when we're you know, there's so many young people in Africa that don't have access to anything and they're not in school, etc. And it's a real problem, right? Because they need a demographic dividend. They need everyone under 21 to start being productive and being their full self and for Africa to lead forward. But it's just no access to knowledge, really, no access to systems and schools, right? But if the African Union could standardize kind of curriculum a little bit and also allow online teaching and put things through public libraries and so on, where you do have open education resources that are pre-approved, that you do have access to these through their public library interfaces, that you do get accreditation, which is globally recognized, that you could potentially on these digital platforms with the right licensing, and kind of standardization, let's call it, and recognition, you could potentially use the digital transformation to get everyone in school. Maybe not first best, not in person, but everyone getting schooling, everyone upskilling in the labor force, and so on. So this kind of public infrastructure or public ownership of the infrastructure and the content, I think, is a pretty serious issue in terms of enabling people. That's just on the education side to actually drive forward. So this is, but again, it comes back to licensing, infrastructures, ethics, ownership.
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and think about those models. Yeah, as you say, ownership and making sure that things work in the public interest. I'm going to hand over to Rachel. I don't if you had sort of thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking through a couple of different points that have been raised here. So one around sort of digital infrastructure. I think it's quite remarkable. I mean, if you think about the digital infrastructure for scholarly publications, we were one of the very first to have a digital online journal. I think we beat Google's search engine by at least 4 years by getting that up and done. And so you have this idea that now, we've digitalized back files up until 1800. You have this vast, amazing resource, which is completely, indexed and structured and the like. And that's really quite, I think, remarkable, because it's every publisher, the publishing standards around it is quite fantastic. And we see the benefits in things like accessibility, where you're starting to get absolutely superb discussions around, alt text for mathematical equations and all sorts of stuff, where we're really kind of, I think, pushing the envelope there. But I would also sort of say, like, in terms of where we see potential threats in a knowledge agenda, is really around, we're getting requests for, and I'm talking broadly in the industry, we're getting requests for, researchers to remove their names from articles which relate to climate change or inclusion and diversity. They want to have anonymous publishing. We also start to see, data sets, which we've been so passionately advocating that, researchers would disclose or link to and create those linkages. Those are disappearing. So the very foundation of the infrastructure, and even, the NIH repository, is being redacted in lots of different ways, which is undermining the SDG agenda in lots of different ways. And I do think that idea of, it's not even self-censorship, it's what we had relied upon is no longer available because of a certain change or a change of a direction, which was never foreseeable. And I think, what that points to me is that, in terms of digitalization, there's been a lot of opportunities. I've talked about the scholarly publications, but if you talk to some of the universities who've done collaborations, they can collaborate with, a lab in Kenya. They don't have to come over to Europe to collaborate. They have full access to all of the iCloud situation. The collaboration capabilities have really increased. And I think you see that in the production of the knowledge as well, where you start seeing these South-South collaborations. But I also would advocate that who's listening to this research? When we looked at clean energy technologies, we did a couple of case studies, and one was on Indonesia. Indonesia has amazing research on clean energy technologies. They have their unique challenges of trying to, decarbonize their energy grids. But that's not necessarily read nor cited by many other countries either. So we still have this incentivization system within knowledge of what is good knowledge. Is that by just, Ivy League universities or a university in the UK? How do we change the orientation of what we deem to be worthy of looking at? And I think that makes a real big difference, because something that's very local or specialized, or perhaps, Maria, to your point, looking at sort of an Indigenous culture, for example, is probably not going to be read somewhere else, but it could equally have an applicable situation or a case to be read in its local environment. And so I do think there's kind of this idea of, who's listening to it, the research and the incentives that are around this. And I do think that there's something here around weaponization of knowledge. So sometimes I find, and I work, as Stephen will know, a lot more in sort of broader publishing, so trade and education. And I think culture is kind of out of the mix. You do get, a little boy in Yemen, and he's on watching Kim Kardashian on his phone, right? So culture as a way of, making sure that we understand what trusted knowledge is or what knowledge is kind of, that also needs to be a bit defined. I mean, I'm looking at it from a very narrow lens of scholarly publications, but knowledge can be around asking critical questions or challenging what we're seeing on an AI generated Facebook post. And I think the erosion of the media and the journalistic industries, particularly in the global north, is really undermining some of the ideas of how we are digesting what is a fact and what is not. And this becomes problematic if we start thinking about things like vaccinations or things like, an emergency response. If there's an extreme weather or a pandemic, where do we get our information from? And that's fundamentally changed due to the media landscape changing. And I think the knowledge agenda has to acknowledge that it's not just about knowledge production, but it's also about how it's disseminated and what platforms are going to be there for us to be thinking about this. And it's kind of a very strange situation where, it's not clear what's paid and what's not, what's generated, what's not. And even if you're told that it's AI generated, you will still likely change your behavior and your thinking around it. And I think that's a very scary situation.
Well, exactly. And there's also wildly different ways of using AI
Yeah,
in there.
definitely.
So yeah. So, but we've not got much time left. So I want to leave time for Marie and Costanza to jump in. So I'm going to go to Marie. I won't paraphrase.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to Patrick and Rachel and Constanza for their contributions to the panel. I don't have much more to add to Patrick and Rachel's intervention to that fantastic question, other than saying that digital transformation do give us an opportunity to think more holistically. For example, in my own field, which is around producing science, using that science for impact policy and diplomacy. Thanks to technology, thanks to digital transformation, I can now understand how interconnected the knowledge ecosystem that we work is. So it helps us that way. For example, I can now know who publishes with who is researching with who, in what topics, what are the challenges, what are the gaps. Perfect. However, digital technologies alone are not enough to help us reshape how knowledge is produced. And I believe that there's still a potential of the digital transformation to be explored for the purpose of our conversation. So, for example, how is it shared? How is it validated? How is it accessed and used in the national and international public discourses, for example, and to connect to the points that were previously made. So if we focus only on technology transformation, we risk perhaps overlooking deeper questions around trust, around equity, around governance, around participation, around institutional capacity, which was what I mentioned in my first intervention, around democratic values as well. So that link is essential. I believe democratic values should lead digital transformation, technological change, not the other way around, which is actually what is happening. And so we definitely need something broader, Stephen, to answer to your question. We cannot dehumanize the element part of this. And given time, I just wanted to close my intervention in the panel by just sharing one thing about public libraries, to cite them again, because I learned so much about an element that we don't usually talk about, think about libraries when you don't work in libraries, which is that they are not only repositories of knowledge, they are also the social tissue, social infrastructure for a community. They welcome migrants, for example, arriving in a new city. They help them settle in, adapt to digital tools, adapt to the language of the city, adapt them to navigate a new ecosystem. And I think that particular social tissue is so essential for the discussion that we're having, is so essential for the post 2030 agenda that I wanted to just bring it to our participants to our conversation to not forget that essential role that public libraries have.
Thank you. So you're doing my job better than I do. That's great. Thank you. I'll hand over to Costanza. I'm conscious we're pretty well at time, but I want to give time to Costanza to answer as well.
Yeah, thank you. Well, a lot has been said, so I'll try to be a little shorter. But yeah, this is a very good question. I agree very much with Maria that the values should lead the digital transformation and not vice versa. As a digital platform, we think a lot about this, and I want to go back to my initial remark that it's really about the infrastructure. It's not whether the digital means are bad or good per se, but really is about how you create an infrastructure of knowledge and how you give access to this infrastructure. A couple of years ago, I was working with the Freedom Online Coalition. I'm still working with the Freedom Online Coalition, but at the time, we worked together with the Netherlands and Denmark and others on a blueprint on information integrity, which I'm gonna link here. And we tried to have like a positive vision of what it could be, like a good digital information ecosystem. And so it very much focuses on agency for the user. That's why the community-led model, we think it's important because, that it gives that. It does present more risks today, though, as I think Rachel was saying that the scientists now want to publish anonymously, etc. We have a similar issue with our community, where they can edit anonymously, but a lot of them have not done that because they felt safe, but then the environment has changed so much that then they can be unsafe. We have Wikimedians who have been arrested for writing on Wikipedia, prosecuted, similar to journalists, although maybe it's less known. And one thing that I want to say is from our conversation that I had many years ago with a librarian, who manages the Italian Presidential Library, the Quirinale Library, and we had this very insightful conversation, and she was telling me, which is something I kept to art, like what you exclude is almost as important as what you include, right? It's, in other words, you have to really work on the sources and edit. And that is something that we are struggling with a little bit online today, where we have so much content, but not all of that content is reliable, or yeah, it's impossible now to assess the percentages, but yeah. And so that's why Wikipedia focuses a lot on sourcing, both reliable sources. The communities decide both what are reliable sources and also what are unreliable sources that should never be used. But then on the wider internet, and especially if we access through LLMs, etc., where we don't have the transparency on the data set, we have no way to trace the information back to a source, which is something that libraries have done forever, right? And that is really one of the key components, that curation, and then that guidance. Yeah, I'm gonna stop here.
Thank you so much. We are already over time, so I'm very keen to be respectful of everyone's program. So I will just wrap up in 30 seconds or so, and let people get on with your days, and Patrick maybe with his coffee break as well. Hopefully they haven't eaten all the cannoli before you get out there or whatever. I I think I don't know, a point that it felt came through, and I'm really happy with the answers to that question, that it's going to be really important that, I don't know, we think about infrastructures, but in particular we break out the idea that infrastructures are purely the physical things, because a lot of work around digital transformation has tended to focus on how do we make sure we get everyone online on the physical infrastructures. And of course, the physical infrastructures have this huge domination by private sector actors, which, I don't know, to the extent that access to knowledge fits with their overall economic approach, it's great, but there's a limit to that. And what we rather need to do is expand out a lot further and think of infrastructures in a more, political science sense of being those collections of institutions, of knowledge itself, of culture, and as things that actually need to be governed in ways and where we do need to be proactive and that need to be proactive and ready to get involved to ensure that we're upholding equity, that in all the dimensions that there is from end to end and circular throughout that. And I think just to come back to that point that was made so powerfully at the beginning, the relevance of the 2030 agenda and the post-2030 agenda in providing that global steer, because it's something that we can't do it can't be done at the national level. It does need that longer term perspective. It does need that recognition of the value of doing things effectively there, of doing things right. So I want to say we're already 6 minutes over, so I will close. I just wanted to say huge thanks to Rachel, to Maria, to Costanza, to Paul for your interventions. That was fantastic. As I will be, STI forum demands that I do a note anyway, so we'll do a note, but I've got lots of notes, so I'll also try and do something a little bit more considered, and then obviously share that with all of our speakers for validation, but then also share that more broadly. But I hope this isn't the last time we'll be having this conversation. I think the big conclusion coming out that no, we can't neglect knowledge, we can't take it for granted or to address it only from narrow perspectives in the post-2030 agenda. And I hope that we'll all be together again and continue addressing this. I know this conversation could have gone on for a lot longer. But anyway, thank you to everyone once again for all your time and for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks so much. Bye.